I want to speak not in the tone of a politician, not as somebody as a part of the institution that's trying to talk about what he thinks. I want to talk about what I think the people of Georgia think. The people of Georgia really don't understand why we can't do in Washington what they've had to do during the last 3 years. During the economic travails of the last few years, every American family has had to sit around their kitchen table, reprioritizing how they spend their money, deal with lower returns on their investments, the consequences of unemployment or underemployment. They've had to adapt to difficult economic times. Yet when they turn on the television and they look at C-SPAN, they don't see us adapting to the economic times we find ourselves in as a country. You know, I was in the real estate business for 33 years, and I don't understand a lot of things, but I understand leverage. Leverage is a marvelous thing in capitalism. If you've got proper leverage in real estate or proper leverage in business, it can make a lot of things happen. Leverage is good, but too much leverage is a death sentence. And we're at a precipice in this country. We're at a precipice where we're about to fall off, and if we fall off, there is no recovery. Because the results of continued deficit spending and continued increasing debts are two things: inflating the dollar in future years to pay that debt off with cheaper dollars, which devalues every asset of every American family, and increasing interest rates to unsustainable and unpayable amounts. I lived through that once in the post-Carter years of 1980, 81, and 83, when we dealt with the misery index in America: double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, and double-digit interest rates. We basically, in my home state of Georgia today, we do have double-digit unemployment today, 10.4%. Interest rates are low, but it's arbitrary, and they're getting ready to go up. The yield spread curve between 2-year federal debt and 10-year U.S. debt is triple, which indicates the markets that are buying our debt are already looking out to the future and saying interest rates are going higher, 3 times what they are now, maybe more. And if you look at inflation, inflation is arbitrarily low right now, but with what's happening to food and prices contributed by gasoline and petroleum, what we see happening in the world marketplaces, it's an inevitable factor unless we get our arms around our debt and our deficit. Now, we owe about $14 trillion in debt. The deficit this year is over $1.5 trillion. Those are unsustainable numbers. We don't have to pay the debt off today. We don't have to reduce the deficit to zero. But we have to get ourselves on a guide path to reducing our deficit and in turn reducing our debt over time. And it means we have to sit down at our kitchen table, the floor of the United States Senate, the floor of the United States House, prioritize what we're doing, and get to the business the American people expect us to get to. We're playing some political games right now with short-term CRs when the big votes, the big debates, and the big decisions loom ahead. First, the debt ceiling. Later, the FY12 appropriations. And there are 3 things I hope we will do. Number 1 is recognize our system today is broken and is not working. I did a little research. Most of my years in Congress, more dollars have been appropriated through omnibus appropriations than through legitimate debate of budget units on the floor. We didn't do any last year. The reason we're doing a CR this year on last year because it was an omnibus appropriation. We're not spending our money like the American people have to spend theirs. We're not prioritizing. We're not looking at cost-benefit analysis. We've got to change our system. I am pleased to have joined with former Governor Shaheen of New Hampshire, a Democratic colleague, to introduce the Biennial Budget and Appropriations Act for the Congress. An act that mimics what 20 of our states, 40% of the country, already does. And that is appropriate on a 2-year cycle rather than a 1-year cycle. Appropriate in odd-numbered years so that in even-numbered years, which also happen to be election years, we don't do appropriating, we do oversight. We spend a year not making political promises of what bacon we're going to bring home, but we spend a year looking for savings and redundancy and duplication and waste in federal spending. You know, if you don't spend a minute looking back, you can never spend a minute looking forward. And right now, we don't spend any time looking back and seeing where money's being spent and where it might be saved. We don't reprioritize those things that were introduced and established years ago. The Biennial Budget and Appropriations Act requires the President of the United States to submit a biennial budget, requires Congress to act on the independent budget units in a 2-year fashion in the odd-numbered year, and requires the oversight in even-numbered years of every function of the federal government. We don't do oversight anymore, and we're paying a terrible price for it. That's the first thing that we need to do. The second thing we need to do is understand that we need to appropriate our money the way the American people appropriate their money. They measure the benefit compared to the cost, and if the benefit to their family is not equal or greater than the cost, they don't spend the money. But in the United States Congress today, we don't measure cost-benefit analysis. We measure how much more we can spend in continuation to what we appropriate in a previous year. And that's a broken system, and it's a broken cycle. I commend Senator Corker on his introduction of the CAP Act, which is the second part of what we need to do, and that's put ourselves in some type of fiscal constraint through a balanced budget amendment and through a spending cap. You know, a little-known secret is the nation of Israel, which 2 years ago confronted problems like the ones we have today. Burgeoning debt, a bigger deficit, and spending problem. Prime Minister Netanyahu and their finance minister sat down at their kitchen table in Israel, in Tel Aviv, and they established a biennial budget process of 2-year appropriations rather than one, of even-numbered election oversight and odd-numbered appropriating. And then they did a second thing. They put a cap on their debt, and they put a cap on spending. And you know what happened in 2 years' time? Israel's GDP has grown by 7.9%. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have told the EU and some of the struggling countries in the EU, like Portugal and like Spain, that they should adopt the biennial spending process and the oversight process of a biennial budget and appropriation act. Well, I would say this, if 20 of our states are doing it, and they're 20 of our most fiscally sound states, beginning with New Hampshire and Nebraska and Oregon and states like that, and if Israel has done it and demonstrated in difficult world economic times, they can grow their GDP by 7.9% and reduce their debt and cap their spending. And if the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are telling the European Union, which is in most difficult straits today, that it's the answer, part of the answer to how they spend their money and getting an arm around their spending, then I think we should take a look at it, and it should be on the floor of the United States Senate being debated. We have a window of opportunity. We have the chance to reform our spending process, to set ourselves on a glide path to reducing our debt and reducing our deficit over time, and send a signal to the world market that the strong America they've known and invested in is going to be even stronger in the future. But if we continue to dilly-dally around, trying to make political headway out of economic events and push ourselves out in time on debt and deficit, we're going to have higher inflation, higher interest rates, we're going to devalue the assets of the American people, and worst of all, we're going to lose our place in the world. I don't want to be a part of that. The President doesn't want to be a part of that. I don't think any member of the Senate wants to be a part of that. So my encouragement to the leadership, Democratic and Republican alike, let's let the best ideas flow. Let's let them come to the floor of the Senate, and let's debate them. And let's invite the President to come and sit down with us and do the same thing. Instead of taking entitlements off the table, they ought to be part of the discussion. Instead of saying there's some things I'm not going to do and some things I will, we ought to be open and say we'll look at everything and then we'll prioritize based on cost versus benefit. If we do that, we'll do what the people of Georgia expect me to do, and I think what the people of the United States expect all of us to do. Mr. President, we have a great country made great by great people who made difficult decisions in difficult times. This is the difficult decision facing our time. I want to be one of the people that's a part of the solution, not a footnote in history to the beginning of the decline of the United States of America. And I yield back the balance of my time and suggest the absence of a quorum.